carved into the walls of a temple in southern Egypt, is a sentence that Egyptology has never fully explained. It says, the building in front of you is not the original, it is a copy. The real one stood somewhere else in a much older world, and it was built by beings the Egyptians called the Shabtu, a name that translates roughly to those who fashioned things, or as generations of scholars have rendered it, the builder gods. This is not a fringe theory pulled from a discredited paperback. It is written directly on the walls of the Temple of Edfu, one of the best preserved religious structures in Egypt, and it has been studied by mainstream Egyptologists for over a century. What it says about who built Egypt's oldest sacred spaces and how is stranger than almost anything you have heard about the pyramids, and it comes from a source most documentaries never mention. The Temple of Edfu sits on the west bank of the Nile, about 100 kilometers south of Luxor. Construction began in 237 BC under Ptolemy III and continued for over a century, making it a genuinely late building by Egyptian standards. Finished long after the pyramids, long after the New Kingdom, long after the age of Rameses. But the inscriptions carved into its walls, known collectively as the Edfu building texts, do not describe the temple as a Ptolemaic creation. They describe it as the latest in a chain of reconstructions, stretching back to the beginning of the world, each one rebuilt on the same sacred ground because that ground itself was considered holy, the site of the first act of creation. The scholar most responsible for bringing these texts to wider academic attention was Eve A.E. Raymond of the University of Manchester, whose 1969 study, The Mythical Origin of the Egyptian Temple, remains the standard reference. Raymond argued that the building texts preserve what she called the oldest surviving conception of the Earth's origin in Egyptian religious literature, older in its underlying ideas than anything found in the more famous creation accounts from Heliopolis or Hermopolis. According to this material, in the earliest age, before the current world existed, a primeval island rose out of a boundless expanse of water. On that island, a group of divine beings began the work of creation itself. Among them were the Shabtu, the builder gods, tasked specifically with construction, and alongside them a group the texts associate with wisdom and measurement, sometimes described as 7 in number, an echo that later scholars have compared to the 7 sages of Mesopotamian tradition, figures said to have lived before a great flood and to have taught humanity the arts of civilization. The texts are saturated with flood imagery. The primeval waters recede gradually, exposing a mound. That mound becomes the foundation of the first temple, built according to a precise ritual. A cord is stretched between stakes to fix the orientation, a specific alignment tied to the stars is established, and the structure is raised within an enclosure. The texts describe in cubits, the standard unit of Egyptian measurement. This ceremony, known as the stretching of the cord, was not a one-time mythical event confined to old stories. Egyptian kings performed it, or had priests perform it in their name, at temple foundations for over 2,000 years, always invoking the same original act described at Edfu. When a pharaoh laid the foundation of a new temple, the ritual explicitly framed the act as a repetition of what the Shabtu had done at the dawn of time. The texts also describe the physical dimensions of that first structure with unusual precision. An enclosure measured at roughly 300 by 400 cubits, oriented according to observations of circumpolar stars, stars that never set below the horizon and were used throughout Egyptian history to fix true north. This detail matters because it shows that even in a mythological account, the Egyptians embedded the same practical, technical concerns that governed their real temple building: precise measurement, precise orientation, and a ceremony that treated the act of construction itself as sacred, not incidental. Later, Egyptologists studying the alignment of actual temples and pyramids, including the orientation methods used at Giza itself, have found genuine evidence that circumpolar star sightings were used to establish true north to within a fraction of a degree, a level of accuracy that still impresses modern surveyors. Whether or not the mythical first temple ever physically existed, the ritual grammar the Edfu texts describe: cord, stake, stars, cubits, matches, what we know real Egyptian builders were doing for thousands of years. What makes this worth taking seriously as history, rather than dismissing as simple religious poetry, is how consistent the underlying idea is across Egyptian sacred architecture. The concept the Egyptians called Zeptepi, the first time, recurs throughout their religious literature as the golden age when the gods themselves walked the earth, ruled as kings, and established the templates that human institutions would later imitate. Every major temple in Egypt claimed in some form to be a copy of an ideal structure from that first time. The Edfu texts are simply the most detailed surviving account of what that original structure supposedly looked like, who built it, and how. Raymond and later scholars have been careful to describe this as Egyptian sacred cosmology, almost a religious framework for explaining the origins of temples and their rituals. It is not a construction manual, and Egyptology does not treat the Shabtu as literal beings who existed prior to the human archaeological record. But it is real, documented, and considerably older in its core ideas than most viewers realize. There is a second, less mythological text that adds a strange layer to this picture, and it comes from the court of the very pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid. The Westcar Papyrus, a collection of stories likely composed sometime in the Middle Kingdom and copied onto the papyrus we now have around 1650 BC, is set at the royal court of Khufu, the pharaoh whose pyramid still stands at Giza. In one of its stories, Khufu is told about a magician named Jedi, who reportedly possesses knowledge of the number of the secret chambers of the sanctuary of Thoth. Khufu, wanting this knowledge for his own building projects, has Jedi brought before him. Jedi says he does not know the number himself, but he knows exactly where the information is kept. Inside a chest of flint, in a building at Heliopolis called, in most translations, the Inventory, or House of Records. It's worth pausing on how unusual this is as a piece of ancient literature. The Westcar Papyrus is often treated as light entertainment, a set of court tales meant to flatter a king and amuse an audience, and in large part, that's exactly what it is. But embedded in that entertainment is a detail no storyteller needed to include for the plot to work. A named building, a named city, and a named container, holding technical knowledge that even a powerful king could not simply invent or command into existence. He had to go looking for it in a record older than his own reign. That is a strikingly specific claim to insert into a story, if the underlying cultural assumption that sacred and technical knowledge was archived and consulted, rather than freshly created by each generation, wasn't already deeply embedded in how Egyptians thought about their own history. Egyptologists have long puzzled over this passage. I.E.S. Edwards, who spent decades as keeper of Egyptian antiquities at the British Museum, noted that Heliopolis had been a center of Egyptian astronomical learning since the earliest recorded times, its high priest bearing the title Chief of Astronomers. The scholar F.W. Green suggested the building described functioned as something like an architectural archive, a place where plans and technical records were stored. Sir Alan Gardner, one of the most respected Egyptologists of the 20th century, went further, arguing the passage implies Khufu is seeking older documentation related to the design of sacred structures. Whether or not the story is a literal history, it reflects something Egyptians themselves believed, that the knowledge behind their oldest and most sacred buildings came from documents even older than the buildings themselves, records that later kings thus consulted rather than invented from scratch. Now set that mythology and that literary tradition aside for a moment, because the actual construction of the pyramids has its own set of open, evidence-based mysteries, and two of the most significant have only emerged in the last 2 years. The first concerns the Great Pyramid's interior. In 2015, an international collaboration called the Scan Pyramids Project began using cosmic ray muon radiograph, a technique that detects subatomic particles raining down from space to map density variations inside solid stone, essentially taking an X-ray of the pyramid without touching a single block. In 2017, 3 independent detector teams using 3 different technologies, nuclear emulsion film, scintillator hodoscopes, and gas detectors, all confirmed the same finding. A previously unknown void sitting above the Grand Gallery at least 30 meters long with a cross-section comparable to the gallery itself. It was published in the journal Nature and remains, to date, the most significant unexplained structural discovery inside the Great Pyramid since the 19th century. In 2023, the same project precisely measured a second, smaller corridor-shaped void behind the pyramid's north face, roughly 9 meters long. Neither space has been physically entered. Both exist, for now, only as density maps. To put the scale of that 2017 discovery in perspective, it's the kind of finding that would normally take decades to organize physical access to, and as of today, still hasn't happened. Muon radiography works because muons, subatomic particles created when cosmic rays strike the upper atmosphere, rain down on the Earth constantly and pass through solid rock, but get absorbed at slightly different rates depending on the density of the material they pass through. By placing detector plates inside and around the pyramid's known chambers for months at a time, the Scan Pyramids team could build a density map of everything above and around them. The same basic principle used in medical CT imaging, just powered by particles from space instead of a machine. That 3 independent detector technologies, run by 3 separate teams who didn't know each other's results in advance, all converged on the same void is what gave the 2017 announcement its credibility in the scientific community. And it's why Nature, one of the most rigorously peer-reviewed journals in the world, agreed to publish it. The discovery reopened a debate that had been mostly settled in textbooks. How were 2-ton to 60-ton blocks actually lifted to build a 146-meter structure containing well over 2 million blocks? apparently at a pace of roughly one block every few minutes across a construction period of around 20 years. The traditional answer has been external ramps, earthen or rubble inclines dragged alongside the growing structure. But no confirmed remains of a ramp large enough to reach the pyramid's upper courses have ever been found at Giza, and the logistics of building and then completely removing a ramp of that scale have troubled engineers for decades. In 2024, a team led by French researcher Guillaume Landreau proposed a genuinely new answer, published in the peer-reviewed journal PLOS1. The study focused not on the Great Pyramid at Giza, but on the older step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, generally regarded as Egypt's first monumental stone pyramid, built around 2680 BC. Using hydrological mapping of the surrounding landscape, the researchers argued that a massive enclosure near the site, called the Gisar el Mudir, whose function had never been convincingly explained, functioned as a check dam designed to trap sediment and seasonal floodwater. They further proposed that a moat-like structure surrounding the Djoser complex, particularly a series of deep compartments in its southern section, functioned together as a water treatment and settling system, and potentially as part of a hydraulic lift mechanism that could have helped raise building material using controlled water pressure. It's a genuinely novel hypothesis. Published through normal peer review, and Landreau himself has pointed out a real gap in the historical record that makes it plausible. The earliest surviving pyramid texts, our main body of religious and technical writing from this era, only appear around the 5th dynasty, more than a century after Djoser's pyramid was built. For the actual construction period, we have almost no contemporary documentation at all, which leaves real room for technologies that were later forgotten, modified, or simply not written down. The second new theory approaches the problem from inside the Great Pyramid itself, and it was published even more recently. In late 2025, researcher Simon Andreas Schöring published a paper in NPJ Heritage Science, a part of the Nature Journal family, proposing that the Great Pyramid's interior architecture was not incidental to its construction, but functional to it. Schöring focused on a detail long noted but never fully explained. The Grand Gallery and the ascending passage share the same slope, close to 26.5 degrees, and sit in a straight line with each other and with the descending passage below the pyramid's base. His proposal is that these connected corridors functioned as a single internal sliding ramp. Heavy counterweights, potentially loaded sleds or blocks, would be released to slide downward along this internal slope, and the resulting tension, transmitted through ropes over beam-like supports, would help draw building blocks upward through the pyramid's core. In this model, the antechamber, a small granite-lined chamber just before the king's chamber, long assumed to be a purely defensive feature meant to block tomb robbers, is reinterpreted as part of the pulley mechanism itself. What separates this from speculative pyramid content you might have seen elsewhere is where it was published and how it was built. NPJ Heritage Science is a peer-reviewed journal within the Nature portfolio, meaning the paper went through formal review by other researchers before publication, and it is explicit about presenting a testable model rather than a confirmed fact. Schöring, notably, is not a career Egyptologist, but a scientist by training, approaching the pyramid as an engineering and physics problem rather than starting from established archaeological consensus, which is part of why the proposal has generated both genuine interest and genuine pushback within the field. Schöring points to physical evidence to support the idea. The ascending passage has an unusually hard, polished floor, while the floor of the Grand Gallery shows scrape marks consistent, in his interpretation, with something being dragged or slid along it repeatedly. He also notes that the pyramid was not built as a simple, symmetrical stack from the ground up. Instead, its internal structure suggests construction proceeded outward from a central point in phases, which would make an internal lifting system considerably more efficient than hauling every block up an external incline from the base. It is worth being precise about what this theory is and is not. It has not been physically tested inside the pyramid, no shaft matching the model has been confirmed, and Schöring's own paper describes it as a proposal to be evaluated, not a settled finding. Several Egyptologists have welcomed it as a serious, physics-grounded alternative worth investigating further, while others remain committed to ramp-based models, refined over decades of study. That disagreement is normal, healthy science, not evidence of a cover-up. If the scan pyramid's voids and the pulley hypothesis raise questions about how the pyramids were physically built, a genetic discovery announced in the summer of 2025 raised questions about who was moving between civilizations while they were built. Researchers at the Francis Crick Institute in Liverpool, John Moores University, publishing in Nature in July 2025, announced they had sequenced the first complete whole genome ever recovered from ancient Egypt. The individual, an adult male, had been excavated back in 1902 by British archaeologist John Garstang at a site called New Wayrat, a village roughly 260 kilometers south of Cairo. His remains were donated to the World Museum in Liverpool, where, remarkably, They survived a Nazi bombing raid during the Second World War that destroyed most of the museum's other anthropological holdings. Radiocarbon dating placed his life between roughly 2855 and 2570 BC, meaning he lived during the period bridging Egypt's early dynastic era and the Old Kingdom, precisely the window in which Djoser's step pyramid was raised at Saqqara. The genome revealed something historians had long suspected but had never been able to confirm at the level of an individual person's DNA. Around 80% of his ancestry traced to North African populations, consistent with the broader Egyptian population of the time, but roughly 20% traced specifically to the Eastern Fertile Crescent, the region including Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. This was the first direct genetic evidence of actual human migration between Mesopotamia and Egypt, rather than inference based only on shared pottery styles or trade goods. His skeleton told an equally interesting story. Despite being buried with high status in a ceramic pot inside a rock-cut tomb, his bones showed signs of a lifetime of hard, repetitive physical labor, worn teeth, significant arthritis in his neck, and muscle attachment markings on his arms and legs, consistent with the repeated motions of pottery production. The potter's wheel itself, a Mesopotamian invention, arrived in Egypt and spread during roughly this same period, right as Egypt's earliest pyramids were being constructed. Taken together, the genome and the skeleton point toward exactly the kind of technological and cultural exchange between Mesopotamia and Egypt that the pottery wheel's arrival already implied, now visible in a single human life. It's important to be precise about the limits of this finding, too. All this is a single individual, not a population-wide survey, and the study's own authors are careful to say the results describe one man's ancestry, not a blanket claim about the ethnic makeup of Old Kingdom Egypt as a whole. Egypt's brutal climate has destroyed almost every other opportunity to recover ancient DNA from this period. The only reason this genome survives at all is an unusual combination of burial in a sealed ceramic pot inside a rock-cut tomb, conditions that happen to slow the DNA's decay long enough for 21st century sequencing technology to recover it. Researchers involved in the study have said they hope future finds will let them determine more precisely when this Mesopotamian ancestry entered the Egyptian population and how widespread it was. While none of this proves the Edfu building texts describe literal historical events, and no reputable Egyptologist claims it does, but it does something more interesting than confirming an ancient astronaut narrative. It shows that the Egyptians' own belief about their monuments, that the deepest knowledge behind their sacred architecture came from somewhere older and was passed down rather than invented fresh. Wong sits alongside a genuine archaeological record of ideas and people moving into Egypt from the Fertile Crescent for centuries before and during the Pyramid Age. The mythology and the genetics are not the same kind of evidence, and conflating them is exactly the trap a lot of pyramid content falls into. But placed side by side, honestly, they tell a more interesting story than either one alone. A civilization that explicitly framed its own greatest achievements as continuations of something ancient, built by people whose ancestry really did include populations from far beyond the Nile Valley. There is one more site worth mentioning, not because it connects directly to Egypt through solid evidence, but because it reshapes what ancient almost even means when we talk about monumental construction. Gobekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is the oldest known monumental stone structure on the planet. Radiocarbon dating places its earliest phases around 9500 BC, meaning it was built by hunter-gatherers roughly 7,000 years before Egypt's first pyramid and even before agriculture existed anywhere in the region. Its T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing as much as 15 tons, were carved, erected, and then deliberately buried by the people who built them, for reasons still debated. Geophysical surveys suggest as many as 200 more pillars remain buried and unexcavated, meaning archaeologists have likely uncovered only a small fraction of the total site. Its excavator, the late Klaus Schmidt, spent years arguing that its existence overturns a basic assumption of how civilization developed, that monumental architecture requires settled agriculture first. Well, what Gobekli Tepe suggests, at minimum, that organized large-scale construction predates farming, not the other way around. Some popular accounts claim that specific carved symbols at Gobekli Tepe, particularly on the so-called vulture stone, precisely match tools or symbols found in Egyptian art thousands of years later. That specific claim does not hold up to scrutiny. There is no peer-reviewed study establishing a direct symbolic link between Gobekli Tepe's carvings and Egyptian construction imagery, and no evidence that Egyptian builders had any knowledge of a site buried and abandoned millennia before Egyptian civilization existed. What Gobekli Tepe genuinely demonstrates, without needing any invented connection to Egypt, is that our timeline for organized human construction is far deeper and far stranger than the standard story most of us learned in school That alone should be startling enough, and it's worth remembering that Gobekli Tepe itself sat completely unknown to modern archaeology until 1994, when Klaus Schmidt, surveying a site previously dismissed by another research team as an unremarkable medieval cemetery, recognized the tops of buried pillars for what they were. An entire chapter of human history, 7,000 years older than Egypt's pyramids, had been sitting under a wheat field the whole time, misidentified for decades. Now, that's a useful reminder anytime a documentary claims archaeology already has all the answers. Sometimes it takes one person looking at the same ground everyone else already walked past. So where does that leave the beings named in Egypt's own hieroglyphic record, the Shabtu of the Edfu building texts? The honest answer is that they belong to Egyptian religious cosmology, a sophisticated origin story that framed every act of sacred construction as an echo of a mythical first act performed at the dawn of time. That is not a lesser story than an ancient astronaut narrative. It is arguably a richer one because it is real. It is documented on stone that still stands today. And it reveals something true about how the Egyptians understood their own civilization, not as something they invented from nothing, but as a continuation of something they believed came before them. It's a pattern worth sitting with, a civilization that built some of the most enduring structures in human history, and then told anyone who would listen that even they were just following a plan someone else had drawn up first. Layer that belief against the archaeological record, the muon-detected voids still sealed inside the Great Pyramid, the hydraulic and mechanical theories still being tested by real physicists and engineers, and a genome that proves Mesopotamian people and Mesopotamian technology really did reach Egypt during the Pyramid Age. And you get a picture of ancient Egypt that needs no embellishment. The gaps in our knowledge are real. The unopened voids are real. What we don't yet know about how those blocks were actually lifted is real. The Egyptians telling us, in their own words, that they saw themselves as heirs to a much older tradition, that's real too. We don't need to invent anything else on top of it. If this kind of deep dive into what the actual ancient texts and the actual peer-reviewed research say is something you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep pulling these threads. The unopened voids inside the Great Pyramid, the ongoing debate over the Djoser hydraulic theory, and what a future muon scan or a physical probe into that grand gallery void might finally confirm. Drop a comment with which mystery you want covered next, and if you learned something new today, give this video a like so more people see the real story instead of the manufactured one.